Hey everyone, welcome to this awesome fireside chat with Kirti Varun, the CPO at Meesho. We're super excited to have him. I'm going to start off with a brief bio where I'll just introduce Kirti to everyone. And then we'll dive sort of into two broad sections of questions. We'll sort of talk a lot more about Kirti and Meesho's product strategy and the way they go about running product with the target demographic that they cater to. And then we'll spend the second half of the questions on Meesho's social impact. As folks have any questions, feel free to post in the Zoom chat. I'll do my best to monitor the chat, and Gert and Timinaya, feel free to just interrupt me at any time if there's a question. And yeah, would love to have Kirti take on some of these questions from the audience. We'll also have time at the end for Q&A. So I'll sort of play it by ear whether we take on some of those questions in the middle or just leave it for the end. But cool, let me start off with a bio. So Kirti is a product leader, tech enthusiast, avid reader, and truth seeker. He is currently Chief Product Officer at Meesho, a social commerce startup in India that has seen 40x growth over the last year and a half, and most recently raised a $570 million Series F in September of last year. Prior to Meesho, Kirti was Director of Product at Flipkart, where he led Flipkart's loyalty and rewards program, among other things. Before that, he was VP of Product at ShopX, an e-commerce startup bringing small retailers and their consumers online. So somewhat similar to Meesho, though we'll talk through the differences, and I'm excited to learn more there. Before ShopX, Kirti was a product leader at Amazon India, building India-specific innovations across item selection, pricing, and affordability. So yeah, and of course, Kirti's professional journey includes more than that, but I figured I'll take the last 7 years snippet that could perhaps be summarized in one word, which is e-commerce. So Kirti, yeah, you've done e-commerce. Of course, you helped build Amazon in India, then later moved on to Flipkart, and now Meesho. What's different about Meesho in terms of the hypothesis it's trying to prove out? How is it different from more conventional e-commerce at Amazon or Flipkart?
Sure. I think maybe I'll just give a bit of context on e-commerce in India, and then I think it'll become easier to understand the difference. So I think e-commerce has existed in India since I think 2007, 2008. So it's like 13, 14 years now. But most of what e-commerce has impacted has been the top 100 million people in the country. And India obviously is a large country, 1.5 billion people now. So there is a large set of people, hundreds of millions of them, who haven't fully been sort of impacted by e-commerce. And if you look at the digital landscape in the country, I think the smartphone internet penetration is about 700 million people. The largest product that's used in India, digital product, is WhatsApp, which has, I think, close to 650 million users. So there is a big chunk of users, almost like 400, 500 million, who are digitally native, but are not exposed to e-commerce, right? So Meesho, therefore, is basically trying to bridge this gap. And the core insight that the founders at Meesho had when we started was that there is a big chunk of customers who haven't come into the fold of e-commerce, and they require a very different kind of e-commerce proposition compared to what I think the conventional e-commerce players are offering. And that proposition was closely linked to the aspirations of these people. So most of these people who haven't been touched by e-commerce are low to mid-income people, people in the sort of what we call the tier 2 and beyond India. And all the mainstream e-commerce players are targeting the tier 1 and metro part of India, right? People in the middle to upper income segment. So therefore, Meesho's focus was, how do we get these people into the fold of e-commerce? And I think the biggest insight there was that all of these people are limited by their economic means. So you need to give them a proposition which is affordable, right? In terms of the kinds of items they buy, the price points at which they buy them, and also the way the core shopping journey should be for them, because most of these people buy things offline, they buy along with their friends, so it's a much more social affair. So I think some of these core insights led to sort of Meesho becoming what it is, and even the company itself has pivoted, starting with being focused on a reseller-led commerce, which is like an intermediary who assists other people to buy, to now being a core B2C e-commerce destination for these people. So I think that's sort of what actually happened. So Meesho's focus has been on a very different segment of the Indian market with a very different value proposition, which has enabled us to sort of grow and scale in India till now.
Yeah, and a word in terms of a word that I use sort of to build that mental model has been moving from e-commerce to social commerce, and now now based on what you said, it sounds like we're going from social commerce back to e-commerce in terms of how Meesho is moving forward. I know ShopX, which is where you were VP of product prior to Flipkart, also shares the same mission as Meesho, democratizing internet commerce for everyone in India. My understanding is that they took a different approach of bringing sort of offline shops online through a direct consumer app. Could you maybe share some of the differences between the two, and sort of how did your learnings at ShopX influence how you build product at Meesho?
Yeah, I think ShopX probably shares a similar mission with Meesho, but the approach is sort of has been very different. I think ShopX, at least at the time when I was there, I think the focus was on more B2B e-commerce. So basically, the product that we had built was to enable small retailers to source items from the wholesalers, manufacturers, and so on. So it was more a B2B e-commerce platform as opposed to a more B2C e-commerce platform. And now I think ShopX is also sort of pivoting to become more B2C. That's a more recent phenomena. So yeah, fundamentally there's a big difference in how both of the companies sort of approach their product strategy. And even the B2B e-commerce space in India is actually fairly large, and there is big opportunity there as well. But it's just a different take on providing access. I think the goal at ShopX was to provide access and empower the small retailers much more. And India is a country of small retailers. There are sort of millions of small retailers spread across the country. So there's a lot of physical infrastructure that's already been built up. So how do you enable them to serve their customers who come to their store? So how do you enable them to find the right selection? How do you enable them to leverage technology to source products at the right prices, etc.? So I think that's sort of where ShopX operated, whereas Meesho obviously is much more direct consumer facing and much more demand focused. So it's a more B2C type play, as opposed to ShopX, which is more a B2B type play.
We have a question from Timinia in the chat. What is the share of reseller-driven business versus B2C for Meesho, and how quickly is it changing?
Sure. I think it has changed quite a bit over the last 2 years. Originally, Meesho started off as a reselling platform, like I mentioned. So it was 100% reselling and 0% direct consumer business. But in the last 2 years, I think it has shifted dramatically. Today, I think it's maybe 40% is reselling, 60% is direct B2C business. And this percentage may keep changing with time. Maybe it'll get indexed more towards consumers. And I think one big reason for the shift in the last few years has been actually COVID and the macro sort of inflection points that got created because of COVID. So especially in India, I think since COVID, the offline to online shift, especially in commerce, has been dramatic. So the kind of penetration of online commerce that we would have expected to happen maybe in 3-4 years actually happened in a matter of few months. And that has sustained even today, even though we are getting back to more normal levels with respect to COVID. So it's more a permanent shift. So that has triggered a lot of people who are earlier uncomfortable buying directly on an e-commerce platform. They've now started coming online, which means that they're much more comfortable coming to, for example, Meesho to buy things directly as opposed to being dependent on a reseller, right? Having said all this though, even though the percentage share has changed, both businesses have grown, right? Even the reselling business, if I look at today, compared to what it was 2 years back, is much larger, right? It's just that the mix has changed. And as we look ahead, I think the mix may shift more towards consumer, but we see very healthy growth even in the reselling part of the business. And I think the reason for that is this plain simple fact that India is a very heterogeneous market. Because when you have a population that's so large, you have consumers of very, very different kinds. So there are people who are comfortable coming online and buying, but there are still many who are not, and they are dependent on an intermediary. And this will continue to exist because the population is so large, right? So maybe in a decade or maybe in 2 decades, this may completely shift. But for a fairly large period of time, I think both of them will continue to coexist and grow.
I see. So in this new shift towards the B2C model, you're seeing the more and more digitally savvy customers actually buy directly from the suppliers. Is it without going through the resellers, or could you help me understand what did the reseller model look like, and now what does the newer model look like in terms of the different stakeholders involved?
Sure. So currently, I think both these businesses coexist on the same product, on the same app, which means that if there are consumers who are comfortable buying directly on the Meesho app from a supplier, then they do that. But there are some who may not be as comfortable because they face many barriers of language, trust, and other things. So they go through a reseller, right? So both of these models coexist on the same product. And both of them sort of are growing. And we've also built our product to make both happen without one trading off against the other.
Yeah, and we'll come back to this sort of aspect of trust in a few questions, because I think that's one of the really key insights into the reseller model. Changing gears, sort of talking more, diving deeper, into the product world. Some context, a few of our SPC members are building social impact organizations in India. So from helping parents of out-of-school kids to helping migrant workers avail of benefit schemes. I'd love to dig deeper into some of the product lessons that Meesho has learned, perhaps the hard way, that might help these Indian nonprofits serving the tier 2, tier 3 users. So to begin with, could you help us understand what does user research look like when you're working with your least tech-savvy customers, because with your tech-savvy resellers, I should say, to be more specific, since some of these resellers have never been online before. This is sort of their first online shopping experience.
Yeah, sure. I think user research is actually a very significant part of how Meesho operates as a company. And we are also one of the very few sort of growth stage startups, at least in India, which have actually a dedicated user research team as well, which works very closely with product and design teams. And I think the reason why we've sort of been this way is because of the simple fact that most of the employees who work at Meesho are all metro tier 1, sort of from those geographies, whereas the customers we are serving are people who are not in those geographies. So it's very tough for you to directly empathize with the customer because you are not that persona, right? You will never, probably no employee would ever order from Meesho directly, right, for their needs, because it's meant for a different segment of the population. So because of that inherent disadvantage, we've actually over-indexed on having user research and many other rituals within the company where product managers, designers talk to users very regularly directly, not through surveys, not through sort of market research, but having direct conversations. So I think that's sort of a muscle that we have built up in the company. And there are many things that we do which are, I think, quite unique compared to most startups in India. I think one thing that we do almost as a ritual is usability testing for every new product feature that we build. So there is no feature that we release which doesn't get tested by real users, almost at the design stage itself, even before it sort of goes into software execution. So we get feedback, we iterate on the designs, and then sort of try to build out the right product. Even a lot of investments happen in understanding users very deeply through foundational research projects and so on. So a whole bunch of things that we've started to do, which help us sort of build this user empathy. We also have a very interesting ritual in the company, which is called listen or die, and it sounds extreme. So what it means is we want everybody at a certain frequency to talk to users directly. So this applies to every person who joins the company new. The first thing that they need to do in the first few weeks is actually to talk to at least 10, 15 users. And even on an ongoing basis, everybody from the junior most to the senior most, like even I talk to users every few months directly, right? So that's something we believe very strongly in. And I think most of the high impact product features that we've built, the core problems we were trying to solve actually have come directly from users, not as much from like us analyzing data or looking at what other companies have done, but actually almost from users just based on these conversations that we have. So I think understanding users, doing user research, usability testing, like all of those have been very deeply ingrained into the culture of the company.
And in my research, I came across a sort of a mental model or framework that you use when you decide when should you use data to back up product decisions and when should you use intuition and qualitative feedback. Could you share that with? I think that would be really helpful.
Yeah, I think it's always a tricky balance to strike. I think I don't know if there is a very analytical framework to make that decision, but one thing I've seen in my career, not just in Meesho, but even before that, is any fundamental innovation that you end up doing almost never comes out of analyzing data. Right? You can use data to make incremental improvements, which means you already have a product, you want to optimize it, you look at data, who's using it in what manner, and you can find opportunities. And that obviously also has a lot of value, especially when your product gets a bit mature, then there's a lot of value that you can derive by looking at data, A/B experimenting, and so on. But a lot of fundamental innovation, which is building 0 to 1 products or coming up with completely new ideas, I think there most of the time it's the vision of a product leader or a founder, or many times it comes from having that deep user empathy, right? Because users will tell you the problems if you are able to sort of connect with them well. So therefore, whenever we try to solve very tough problems or we're trying to truly do something unique, I think we index more towards sort of the vision and the qualitative inputs we get from users as opposed to just looking at data. So we try to balance both. So when we're making optimizations to an existing product, yes, data helps us a lot. But when we're trying to do fundamental innovation, then I think you'll have to trust your product instinct much more. You have to understand users much more. You have to have a vision of how sort of the world will shape up in this particular sort of segment.
You talked earlier about tools that you use for usability testing with a lot of these users and staying sort of close and direct contact with them. Could you share some of those tools that perhaps other product managers can also use to experiment with and understand this particular user base?
Sure. I think before COVID, it was much easier to do all of these things because we were doing it in person. So it was much easier, much more effective. And we were doing it in person. Obviously, we used to create prototypes on the app and we used to show users and ask them to do a task and sort of understand their mental model, note down the feedback and so on. But I think in the last 2 years, because of COVID, the amount of in-person user research has obviously come down a lot. So now we're dependent on a bunch of different tools. I think we use a tool for remote usability testing. I think it's called Look Back, probably. And there are other probably tools of that nature, which basically help user sort of install a certain version of the app remotely, and then they can sort of open it up and do the task in front of you, and you can also sort of note down feedback. We also use another tool which is called UX Scan, which again, I'm sure there are other variants of this similar tool, which is almost like a UX hotspot tool, which means that it remotely monitors what users are doing on the app. Where are they spending more time on? What are they tapping on versus where are they confused? Right? So it almost creates like a hotspot map of every page on your app. So we've started doing that, right? So that gives us a sense on what are some of the usability frictions people are facing on a regular basis. We can then analyze that back and see what kinds of improvements to make. So I think we've invested in some of these sort of more remote usability tools, especially since COVID, to get a better hang of how to design the product to suit the user needs.
A question from Jono in the chat. Could you share an example of something like that you learned as part of this user research, like any example of a high impact feature that then ended up making its way into the product and sort of even providing closure on how it played out over time?
Yeah, I think there are many examples. So I think one of the most fundamental things in our app that you will see is that it's very different from a regular e-commerce app in the sense that most of the way you browse products is through scrolling vertically in the app, right? So if you go to different places, you keep scrolling vertically, and the amount of horizontal scrolling on the app is very limited, right? Now, this is very different from most other e-commerce apps in India. And the core insight behind this, was from certain research that we had done, where we realized that a lot of these tier 2 and beyond users who are coming to Meesho, almost all of them, their first introduction to a digital product is almost always a content or a messaging app, right? So in India, it's WhatsApp, YouTube, right? And earlier TikTok before it was banned. And if you see those apps, all of them have just vertical scroll. There is no horizontal scroll in any of those apps, right? So because the users were so used to that, when we designed something which is more horizontal scroll, they used to struggle, right? So this was not an insight that we sort of knew intuitively. But then once we dug deep and did some research, we realized this. And then obviously we changed the way discovery happens on the app, and that sort of gave us a lot of impact. So there are lots of these kinds of insights which come from going deep to understand like who your user is, how are they actually coming to your app, what have they been exposed to before, how does their day-to-day life look like, where does this fit in. I think there are those kinds of things I think we've been able to unearth, which makes us truly build a product for them, right, as opposed to trying to copy what somebody else may have done.
Yeah, and I know you mentioned earlier building for such a heterogeneous audience, and just to give folks a sense, of course, many are familiar with this already, but India has many states, many 25 to perhaps more different languages. Your user base perhaps spans a lot of different age barriers as well. What are some products or concepts, product concepts or approaches in India that you've seen work that US startup founders might learn from?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So I think one big difference in India, like I think you mentioned, is just the heterogeneity of the market. And especially if you're a company like Meesho, you're trying to build a product literally for 1 billion people, right? So therefore, our ability to sort of segment the market and try to see how many micro segments are there, etc., that kind of effort is not very helpful here. So think of Meesho as almost like a WhatsApp type product. It's a universal product. Like if you go and ask somebody in WhatsApp, hey, who's your user segment? I don't think they'll give you a very good answer because there may be many of them, right? So in that sense, I think the way to think about user segments is very, very different here, as opposed to you building a niche product which is serving maybe 2 or 3 personas which you can very accurately define. Right? This is not that. It's very different. So when you are in this kind of a market, I think it's more important to understand universal needs of people, which is what do most people want? What will work for almost all of them, as opposed to trying to build that will work, something that will work for 10% of them, right? So I think that's one fundamental shift. and especially given you asked about what's different between US and India, I think this is one very big difference. So because the scale is so large, the heterogeneity is so large, if you're targeting a large market, I think you need to understand the concept of this building for universal needs. I think that's one very big difference. I think the other differences to me are more in the way maybe the companies itself operate. And again, I've never worked in a US based startup. I've obviously worked at Amazon, and I have an understanding of how things happen in the US. But one thing I've realized is the velocity at which products are built here is much faster, right? Again, I'm comparing similar scale companies. So it's much faster. So the mindset of iterating faster, the mindset of building something which is right scoped and then learning from it, etc. I do feel it's much better here in terms of just the velocity. I think that's something that is probably different. And again, all of this is very contextual to the business you're in, the market you're in. So, but in general, I think the velocity is something that I would also say is quite different in terms of building products.
A question along the same lines from Yasir. We've seen social commerce, of course, play out in India and then also in some other Southeast Asian countries. What do you think is a core property for a social commerce platform to succeed if one were to say try to replicate that in the US, where in the US at the moment it's predominantly direct selling on social platforms like Pinterest or Google Images or what have you. So yeah, what would be that core property if you had to?
So I think the big difference is in between US and maybe Southeast Asia, India, etc., or China for that matter as well. I think is more in the market characteristics, the demographics, right? So what is very different about these geographies? The biggest difference is the skew in the income pyramid and the size of the population. Those are the two big differences. Like if you take US, for example, the top, whatever, 10-20% wealthy people versus the bottom 30-40%, there is obviously a difference, but it's not as big as it in India or in China. Here, the income disparity is so huge. Because of that, what happens is that the same product that would work for the top 10-20% does not work for the bottom 30-40%. And the best example to look at this is Amazon. Like Amazon has a very large market share in the US, right? That one company can build a product which can serve all the 350 million people, or Netflix, I think somebody wrote in the chat. That's correct. Whereas India is not that. So that is the reason why here e-commerce is not so much a winner takes all type market. You will have multiple players. Same thing has happened in China. You have Taobao, Pinduoduo, but you also have Jerry.com, you have others. So I think that's sort of the biggest difference to understand. And now that you have that kind of a market characteristic, what ends up happening is the e-commerce companies that are focused more on the low to mid-income type segment, they tend to evolve into a commerce platform which is more social in nature, right? Which means they will have more elements where people can buy together. They will have more elements which are more gamified in nature. And the reason why that happens is people in that demographic, the low to mid-income, etc., those are people for whom time is not a constraint. They are not the millennial type population who are always busy, right? They have actually time on their hands. So they're willing to engage in a commerce app much more. That's why all of the apps in India, like Meesho is an example, or if you look at China, Pinduoduo, all of them are very heavy on gamification, right? Because user attention is something that you want to capture because they're willing to spend that. Whereas now, if you translate the same to the US, the disparity is again not as much, right? So because of which the same social commerce type models probably will not work as well in US. But having said that, there are companies who are trying that in the US. So there will be some success. Wish.com is an example, right, for you guys, which is trying something similar. But the extent of success that those kinds of platforms will see, my sense is it is going to be much larger in India, Southeast Asia, China.
You shared a product sort of insight that you derived from the user research and that was very specific to this demographic. Could you share a technological equivalent learning where you had to be creative on the tech side for this particular user base?
Yeah, I think we've done a few interesting tech innovations to again serve this segment of the market. I think the biggest one is the size of the Android app itself. So if you see Meesho's Android app is I think 14 MB in size. If you look at any other e-commerce app which is similar in scale and complexity, they will be upwards of 50 MB, 60 MB. So it's a huge difference. And the reason why we did this is again goes back to the user, right? If you look at the users that we are serving, a lot of them have phones where the memory size is very less because they can't afford phones which have larger memory. So if you want them to have your app all the time, then it has to be of a smaller size. Otherwise, the default behavior for a lot of these customers is they will install apps, buy something, and then uninstall because they don't have space. But if you can build an app which can serve all of the needs, which are very complex, e-commerce is a very complex app, right, compared to social networking or any other apps. So what we did, I think this kudos to our engineering team, is they understood this and then they did a lot of things under the hood to optimize the app size to a level where it's now sort of the cutting edge of innovation, right? So this has actually helped us serve this population in a very big way, having sort of the very small app size. So this is a big technology innovation I think our teams have done.
Sorry, give me 1 second. My laptop is low on battery. I think I saw that. Question from Pete. Which particular product category did Meesho focus on in the early days? And how large was the initial network of suppliers and sellers?
Yeah, I think we started off with largely fashion categories and more specifically women's ethnic fashion. And that sort of was a category that we started off in. And that also was a category where there was a white space in e-commerce. If you look at all of the other e-commerce players at the time, most of them are focused on mobiles, electronics. They were focused on fashion, but again, Western fashion, up higher end fashion. Whereas as Meesho started with ethnic, which is more Indian traditional fashion for women, right? So I think that's sort of how we started. And obviously, initially the supplier base was in a few thousands. Whereas now, if you see Meesho, I think we are almost a horizontal e-commerce platform. We're moving in that direction more and more. And we have more, close to, I think, 0.5 million suppliers now. So obviously things have changed a lot. But I think the initial focus was to pick a wedge in the market where we could truly disrupt, and then slowly we can layer on other categories and truly become horizontal. I think there's another question on the chat that I can see.
Yeah.
Are the suppliers primarily from India? Yes, they are. I think India itself is such a large manufacturing hub with so much selection of different items across categories that we've at least never felt the need to look outside of India to sort of, at least on the supply side, because there's so much untapped market there itself. Because even in India, I think only India has close to 60 million small businesses who sell their goods, of which only 2 million sell online. So there is so much headroom for growth in supply that I think being focused on India itself, I think can help us grow a lot.
I know one of the recent product categories that Meesho has ventured into is groceries with Farmiso. Could you share more from like a strategic product and business perspective? Why groceries, and sort of how did you discard the other alternatives?
Yeah, I think that was an interesting choice for us as well. But it's a very simple choice if you again understand the market. So if you look at all the retail consumption in India, close to 60% of it is grocery. Yeah? And now, especially if you look at the tier 2 and beyond, low to mid income customer segment, there this percentage is even higher. Because if your income is less, you spend more on necessities than luxuries, right? So grocery is a necessity. Fashion is a little bit of a luxury, right? So that is very true. And our mission at Meesho is to democratize internet commerce for everyone. So if we want to further this mission, then I don't think we can do that without being in grocery. I think it's very clear, because as you penetrate the country more and more, you will find people who spend most of their money only on grocery. And if you're not in that category, then it's going to become very tough for you to serve them. So, and because we are already at such a large scale, we are penetrating more and more the deeper parts of the country. So without a grocery proposition, it becomes very tough for us to access that. So after a certain point, it was almost a very natural choice for us when we were looking at the different categories, that this is a place that we definitely had to be in.
Changing gears a little bit, because I'm just keeping a time check. I'd love to dive deeper into Meesho's social impact. I think it's pretty evident that Meesho has changed a lot of lives for the better. To give folks sort of a taste of what that looks like, could you share maybe a user story, a successful user story of the impact that Meesho has had?
Yeah, there are many stories, and I think we keep hearing from these users very regularly. And I'll give you one story which probably represents sort of most of the impact that we've done, because many stories are very similar to this. Like if you look at the resellers that we have on the platform now, and even since the very early days, almost all of them are women. Women in these tier 2 and beyond geographies, low to mid income segment, and almost all of them are housewives. And India, I think the society, especially in these geographies, the way it works is women sort of, most of them, after they get married, they don't do a job, right? There's housewives. And they're dependent on their husband's income. And their main role becomes just supporting the family and taking care of household chores. So that's the archetype of the person that we are serving, and for these women, I think what tends to happen is, because they are dependent on somebody else's income, they don't feel financially independent. Like if they want to buy something for themselves, they'll have to go and ask their husband that, hey, give me some money so that I can buy this, and it's almost becomes a tough thing to sort of negotiate when there are so many other household needs. So that sense of not being financially independent is actually a very big problem. And therefore, once Meesho came into the picture, what all of these women realized is, hey, I can sit at home, without any capital investment, I can do this business of reselling and I can make money. And the only thing I need to do is to influence somebody else to buy. And this person that I'm influencing is somebody who's part of my friends and family network or my social network, right? And when that happened, these people started making money, and they used to also proudly declare their identity as an entrepreneur, because they are making money, they're doing a business, and that increased their self-esteem to such a large extent that it created massive impact. And we hear so many of these stories, right? When they come and talk to us, that the impact that Meesho has made on their life is very significant, right? If you're giving somebody an identity and making them financially independent, I think that's a very big impact you've had on their lives.
Yeah, it's I've read a number of stories during my research, and yeah, absolutely inspiring. So kudos to you and the team. Let's see. I'm seeing some questions in the chat. Have you do you as on the product team? How much of the social impact is measured and tracked and sort of used as a metric for improvement? And on a related but somewhat different question is, have you seen any unanticipated outcomes for these resellers? Do you see resellers like taking on other roles in their communities?
Yeah, in terms of the way we look at impact, I think the direct way we can measure impact is just the income that these people make through our platform, right? So are they making a sustainable amount of income? Is that income growing over time? how many of them are making an income above a certain threshold. So I think that is the metric that we can directly track and which we keep a watch on. And because that automatically directly links to the financial independence point I made. I think that's the core thing that we look at. In terms of your other question on unintended consequences, just to understand the question better, you mean like has it had any negative effects on resellers? Is that what you meant?
Negative or even positive in that I know you mentioned the identity, professional identity, social identity piece, the income piece, even in sort of other ways, have they sort of taken on, this is just assuming, of course, but a bigger role in the community as a result of that? Any sort of things that you found surprising personally that you did not expect?
Yeah, I think one thing which was interesting that we found, and this was during the early part of the COVID time, the first wave of COVID, which was a year and a half back. I think a lot of these women resellers also started creating social impact by actually sort of weaving cloth masks, and they were selling those masks directly on the platform to sort of help other people, because at that time COVID was raging so much and a lot of the infrastructure in the country was not as built out, so there were a lot of people who were struggling to even get masks, right? So a lot of these women, actually, because they were so loyal to Meesho, they felt that, look, we can actually use our time to create these masks and actually sell them on Meesho and influence their network to buy. I think that was a sort of societal contribution that they had made, almost voluntarily. Like, we didn't push them to do it. It was almost because they were loyal to the platform. They knew that the platform had distribution. So many people who could not buy things offline, they could serve them. And this was something that we found, which was quite interesting for us. And just again demonstrates the impact that you can have on people once you give them a platform where they can become financially independent and use their sort of time to social causes as well.
You've I think on the same front, on the COVID front, have you seen Meesho sort of be intentional about using this sort of network that you have with the resellers for other sort of social impact? I know this the mask incident that you mentioned was almost an unintended consequence, but have you is Meesho planning to, or has already planned to use the platform to disseminate, let's say, critical health information, let's say about COVID? Could it be used to harness to deliver health or welfare services? Or do you see all of those social impact, that platform for further social impact, as sort of a separate business?
Yeah, I think we've looked at it more to serve people at the time of the need, as opposed to thinking of it as a business or a new business line. I think when again COVID was at its peak, there was a lot of health information on the app again for people who come to our app to see. We also did a lot of things to ensure the delivery partners who deliver the items, right? All of them were sort of vaccinated at some point, plus also we're following certain precautions so that the items that reach customers are not infected in any way with COVID. So we've done a bunch of those things more to deal with the pandemic and ensure that at that time we are supporting all the stakeholders, delivery partners, customers, suppliers. But we haven't thought of it as a sort of new business that we should get into on a sustainable basis.
Many folks criticize the gig worker platforms like Swiggy and Zomato because they make it difficult for workers to earn a living wage. How does Meesho avoid people, specifically resellers, losing money on the platform, or not even the resellers, even through the delivery logistics network that Meesho leverages? Are you confident that Meesho is offering a form of entrepreneurship that can sustain Indian families?
Yeah, I think some of this criticism you're talking about has been directed at some companies. I think that's correct. But with Meesho, I think we haven't sort of ever faced that, largely also because of the impact that the company itself is creating. Because like if you look at Meesho, I think it's creating impact on multiple dimensions. I think one is the resellers, making them financially independent and giving them an identity that we spoke about. But also it's creating great value for the small businesses, the suppliers, right, who are selling on the platform. Most of the sellers that sell on our platform are people who are small size businesses as opposed to very large suppliers, right? So we are probably the only e-commerce platform that has such a large concentration of small businesses selling, which again is great impact for them because it's increasing their distribution. So and same with the delivery network as well. So we've never sort of faced this kind of sort of scrutiny, so to say, because I think already the impact that's been created is very evident. Having said that, there are ways in which we also protect the interests of all of the people involved. For example, if it's resellers or if it's suppliers or consumers for that matter, there are very clear policies, very high transparency on sort of everything that they do with Meesho. So I don't think this has been a challenge for us, at least in the Indian landscape.
I know we have a number of questions in chat, so I'm going to switch over to sort of addressing some of those. But before I do, maybe one last closing question. Kirti, I know you're an avid reader, so I really want to ask a question from one of my favorite podcasts. What is the book or books that you've gifted most often and why?
I think the book that I've recommended most often, and now we give this as a gift to everybody who joins Meesho as a product person. I think this book is 0 to 1. I'm sure all of you are aware of it. I think it's a great book, one of the best that I've read. And multiple things are unique. One thing with books I've found is often books tend to be much longer than they need to be. so people write many pages to communicate concepts, but this is one of those books where I think it's written in a fashion in which a lot of great concepts are communicated in a very simple and terse manner. I think also the ideas in the book are very contrarian, right? And many things that on the surface would seem crazy, but when you go deep, you realize that they're truly forcing you to think critically, right? The whole aspect of monopoly versus competition, technology versus globalization, right? I think it's fascinating, and for somebody who wants to understand how the world works and think critically, I think I haven't read a better book than this.
Plus one, yeah, love that book. All right, switching over to Q&A in this last 7 minutes that we have. Yeah, maybe Jono, I don't want to steal your thunder. Do you want to ask the question you brought up in chat about the mental health service you're building in India on WhatsApp? Or
yes,
yeah,
well, what you were saying about apps is something that I've experienced myself. So with the mental health service I'm busy building, it's for admittedly a very niche audience, so not your mass audience. I was thinking of building it on top of WhatsApp, and I wondered what Meesho's experience has been using WhatsApp. And what you would flag as some of the challenges and opportunities with building services on top of WhatsApp.
Sure. I think WhatsApp is the largest digital distribution channel in India, especially if you're talking about India, then that's true. And even globally, I think it has 2 billion users, so probably is the largest digital product in the world as well. A lot of the early success of Meesho has been because we were closely integrated with WhatsApp. Right? The entire reselling, where a reseller was influencing an end customer to buy, all of that conversation was happening on WhatsApp. So I think it's been a great way for us to get distribution to really grow the business. So from that standpoint, I think it's been a very sort of positive experience and a good enabler for growth. And even for any business which is trying to figure out a way to drive distribution, then WhatsApp obviously is a great option, right? Now, it depends on the specifics of what kind of business you're talking about. But for most businesses, I think it's a great way to get early distribution, at least. Yeah.
And what about building services on top of it? Sorry, that's the thing I'm interested in, rather than sending users to an app. Sorry, I know I'm stealing extra time from people. So I mean, I could also take this offline if that's better.
No, you're good. You're good. Yeah, all good.
Sure. Maybe just I'll ask you a question to understand this better. When you say building services on top of WhatsApp, can you just explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, so I hope this is applicable for other people, but there's an automated mental health service I'm providing, where you go through a series of sessions, and we're adapting it so that it could all happen on WhatsApp rather than you having to go to an app or a website. And I wondered if you've seen examples of where people have managed to build services like directly into WhatsApp. Like, you know, why does Meesho sell directly through WhatsApp? I mean, I can imagine, you know, I know some of the reasons why, but any interesting thoughts that you might have on products delivered through WhatsApp, not just WhatsApp as a distribution or acquisition channel?
No, it's an interesting idea. At least in the Indian context, I haven't seen products which are directly sort of on WhatsApp the way you described it. Almost all of the products have leveraged WhatsApp for distribution the way I described it before. But what you're talking about, at least I haven't seen it in the Indian context. I think it can definitely make sense depending on the kind of use case you're talking about. If it's a mental health service, and the reason why you're using WhatsApp is because it has distribution, and you believe that whatever is a core value of the thing that you're building can be delivered directly on WhatsApp itself, right? That's, I'm assuming, a hypothesis. So yeah, I mean, it sounds like an interesting idea. I think you should try it out and see. The only thing that I've seen, especially on WhatsApp, or for that matter, any messaging app, is it is serving one core value, right? Which is about messaging, etc. So if you integrate something which is very, very different from it into that same app, like how does that user experience work? How well is it discoverable? Does it take away from the core value? Like, I think there are many of those things that you need to think about, right? And if you look at China, I think it's a good example. You have WeChat, which is like the WhatsApp equivalent. They have built their messaging app to be a super app, right? Whereas I think WhatsApp is not that, or at least I haven't seen that version of it. So if some of those capabilities come in and where it can serve that purpose, then maybe it's a great idea. So that's what I would say.
Thank you so much.
And a related question, I think, Sheng, feel free to unmute and ask the question you had around super apps. Happy to read it out loud too.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for sharing. So just have a quick question about super apps. We're seeing apps like Meesho, WeChat that covers a lot of categories and handle payments. They're popular in Asia and India. I wonder, but it's not getting much traction here in the US. So I was wondering, what's your thoughts that was causing, or what's the reason behind this phenomenon?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question. I've also explored it in the past. I think the core reason is basically the level of sophistication of vertically integrated products that already exist in the US, right? So I'll give you an example. So if you look at US market, for every particular use case, there is already a company which does that very, very well, right? So breadth is lesser, depth is more. And there are many of those which already do well. And that's sort of the typical way in which you build products. And even the consumers are okay with having like 15 different apps, which each serve a purpose very well, right? Now, when you come to India, China, and these markets, here, these are more, I would call, the trust deficit is higher in these markets, which means consumers trust lesser brands or apps to serve their needs. Which means if there is a app which can serve multiple needs, then customers take to it well because they trust this brand. So if they have 15 different services, then they can take to it much more easily. So it's more a function of the trust deficit in the market, which doesn't exist in the US. And that's why you will see in US, you will probably never have super apps, while Uber, etc., are trying their hand at it. Maybe in one sector it can happen. For example, Uber can have sort of a cab ride and a bike and something else. Maybe that can work. But can they get into multiple different things like Meituan in China would have, right? like food delivery, payments, like a whole bunch of things, or Gojek or Grab. So I think that's the core difference, the trust deficit in the market and the consumers trusting one company to do multiple things. Whereas in the US, every company can do different things and consumers are willing to be okay with that. I think that to me is the core insight.
Got it. That makes sense. Thank you so much.
Awesome. I think we're at time, but yeah, this hour flew by. Thank you so much, Kirti, for spending this time with us on your precious Friday evening. Yeah, I'm sure we all learned a ton of insight. So yeah, if everyone could join me in thanking Kirti, that would be awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. It was great, having this chat, and also love all the thoughtful, deep questions as well. Yeah, it was great. Thank you.
Great. See you, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.